Hi guys. Um, First the housework. I'm smoking my Nording pipe, and I've got it set up as a church warden. I prefer that to the shorter stem that I've got to go with it. And in it I've got Peterson's Irish Oak. It's a tobacco that I've come to like immensely, which is strange because it's not an Oriental. But it's the kind of tobacco I like. It's a fairly dry smoke in the mouth. There is an oakiness about it, and I wonder whether there are actually oak leaves in it, but I don't know because I got it as a sample. But it smokes well, and it reminds me of an old tobacco smell. This is a VR to ViTheSamurai, and he asked who had a great influence on our lives. Well, most people mention their parents, and yes, my parents, my mother and my stepfather, had a tremendous influence on my life, but for the worse. And that's all I'm going to say about it. I might say more in another video at a different time. But there was somebody in my stepfather's family who did influence me in a great way. And that was his father, my step-grandfather. He hadn't much education, I don't think. He was born in the late 1800s. He came from a long line of watermen and wherrymen in Norfolk. That line dates back to, I would imagine, I got it back just before the sort of King Charles's time, almost back to the Tudors. He was a wherry captain. He'd had worked in a flour mill, and he was very, very strong, like my stepfather. He could carry 16-stone sacks around with ease when he was younger, and that's the largest sack that, by law, you were allowed to carry in England. I think that's even gone down now. But he was a very good wherry captain. I haven't looked it up for a while, and I might get this wrong, but his boat was named after two saints, John and Matthew, I think they were called, with the name, but as I say, I might have got that wrong. But he would take loads from Norwich down to the sea and maybe even out, further out. But mainly on the sort of Broads they did the wherries. Occasionally they went out and collected ice from sea and came back with a load of ice for ice houses in the days before we had ice making machines. I said he had little education, and he did, but he was very, very intelligent. And he'd collected knowledge in the way I collect knowledge. You pick it up from various places. He was a strict Victorian, and he would get me to stand by his knee, and he would ask me questions and quiz me and give me all sorts of things to sort of answer. He asked me, for instance, what's got 22 legs, a nose and 2 wings, and a tail. 22 legs, a nose and wings. And of course, it's a football team. You know, those kind of riddles. But he would regularly write to the newspaper. If he saw something or was interested in something, he would write to the letters page. And occasionally they would ask him to write a piece for the newspaper. But it could be about anything. And when he died, the newspaper ran an obituary saying how much they would miss his contribution to the letters page and to the newspaper in general. So he had an influence on my life, not by what he taught me or by that, but by that image of a man who was a polymath, interested in everything. And I've tried to style myself in that way. I failed my 11 plus and school was a bit of a disaster. And yet I have an IQ which is in the top 2%. But another person who was a great influence was a nun. She was called Sister Renata. I've told you about Renata before, I think, and we're spending the afternoon talking about pornography with her. She was a German. She was a staunch Nazi. At the same time, her parents were getting English airmen out of the country, and she had no idea that this was going on at home. But she remembered she was part of the firestorms in the great cities, and she told me what it was like coming out of a shelter and seeing people burning while they were stood up, dead, you know, or leant against a sort of building or laid on the floor. Really terrible. But she, like all modern monks, like most modern monks and nuns, had a tremendous sense of humour. And I admired her a lot. She would often sort of give me advice and would be helpful in my ministry. And that brings me to a monk. He was a monk at the time when I first met him. Unusually, he was both Carolyn's and my spiritual director. Normally, a spiritual director would say, I can't be spiritual director to both of you because that would bring conflict. But David wasn't that kind to sort of follow the strict rules. He taught me to begin to live life. He was a counsellor to me. He was a spiritual director. And most of all, he was a friend. We could be out of touch for a year. And then as soon as we met, it would be as if we'd never left each other. David was a homosexual. And he lived with his partner Michael in later life, just before he died. I loved him dearly, and Carolyn loved him dearly. He was great fun to be with. He knew how to live life to the full. He left the monastic community and became a parish priest. Unfortunately, he died. He had liver failure due to heavy drinking. You know, we're not all saints in every area of our life. Saints have their faults, and David had his. But the greatest thing he taught me was to hug. He came home one day after having a hell of a day and said to me, "I need a hug." And he walked across the room and gave me a hug. I stood with my arms stiffly down my side in the Christian manner. We're English. We do not do this sort of thing. And he held me back, sort of held me at arm's length, and looked at me and said, "Stephen, I need a hug. And you need to know the difference between good hugs and bad hugs." And I gave him a hug. And since then, I'll hug anybody. My daughter, who was coming into her early teens at the time, I think found that quite difficult. We were saying goodbye because I was moving, and David came to say goodbye, and he gave me a hug in the house. And my daughter said, "Oh, for God's sake, don't hug my daddy indoors." Meaning, don't hug my daddy. So he grabbed my arm and took me out into the street where there was a bus queue and lots of people passing, and then gave me a hug and a kiss on each cheek. And poor Rebecca said, "Oh, for goodness sake, come back inside." I miss him even now. There are things that he taught me. He taught me to say Mass for a start because I was terribly high church. And when we celebrated together, me as his deacon and he as the priest, we moved as one. It was as if we were joined at the shoulder, at the hips, and the congregation at the end of that service were all said that something special had happened. He'd asked me to preach for him because he considered that I was a good preacher. And when I sat down at the end of the service, he turned to me and said, "You bastard, I've got to follow that each Sunday now." His partner Michael, again, has been an influence on my life. Michael and David were great bears of men, and I consider myself as a bear. And those of you who are in that kind of community will know what that means. I'm a polar bear, a silver bear. Michael loved David, and when David died, it was very hard for him. He gives the impression of being a very tough man, and yet he has been one of the gentlemen who has taught me a lot about how to live and how to behave. He occasionally sort of puts a leather jacket on, and then he looks like a U-boat captain. He will occasionally pretend to be incredibly right-wing, just to the right of Genghis Khan or, that kind of thing. But really, he's a great guy. One of the other people who had a great effect on me was a vicar called Des Kendrick. He read his theology in German. He preached at the Deutsche Evangelical Church, even though he was an Anglican. And he was the most humble man that I think I've ever met. He taught me a lot about humility, a lot about taking the blame when it wasn't your fault. For example, one of his curates forgot a funeral, and he pretended it was himself who'd forgotten it. He recognised that I was an untutored academic and started giving me books to read of theology, particularly a man called Bishop Gore, who actually founded the theological college that I eventually went to. a great man, a very simple man, but very knowledgeable. The other person I want to mention, last of all, who had a great influence on my life, was the father that I didn't know. You might ask, how could he have a great influence on my life? Well, any of us who are illegitimate and don't know who our father was, it leaves a lot of questions. It leaves something missing from your life. But my unknown father gave me the greatest gift he could give me. He gave me his genes. His genes that I believe sort of made me what I am. And I hope that's sort of intelligent, caring, and all the things that I am, good and bad. So I'm going to stop there because I'm realising that it's now moving on to 17 minutes. And as usual, I'll stop with a joke. Donald was a Highlander at heart. He lived in the Highlands. He wore Highland dress all the time. Usually the great kilt, not the Highland dress that you see around, with the jackets and the brogues and all that kind of thing. And he got an invitation to go to Cuba. So he went in his Highland dress. Why not? And when he was in Cuba, he visited this taverna, this bar. And he was sat having a whiskey when this guy came in wearing battle dress and a big, thick black beard and went to the counter, ordered a whiskey, knocked it back and turned to leave. And the barman said, "Hey, what about paying?" And he said, "Castro's army," and walked out of the door. And the guy said, "Okay, yep, bye." And this happened several times during the night. And Donald thought, "I'll give this a try. I deserve free whiskies." And he waited till the bar was fairly clear. Went up to the bar and said, "A glass of whiskey, please." And the barman served him with a whiskey and he downed it and turned and said, "Castro's army." And the barman said, "Where's your big black beard?" So Donald bent down, grabbed the hem of his kilt, lifted it up and said, "Castro's Army Secret Service," and dropped his kilt.